April 14, 1945. The spring air carried the scent of blooming lilacs through the shattered windows of a makeshift detention facility in the Rhineland, where 37 German women huddled together in what had once been a school gymnasium. Outside, the rumble of Allied vehicles grew louder as the final phase of the European conflict neared its end. Greta Hoffmann, a former communications operator for the German armed forces, pressed her back against the cold brick wall and whispered fervent prayers, convinced that within hours she and her companions would meet the most horrific fate imaginable. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these women could never have predicted was that their deepest fears, born from years of systematic propaganda and racial hatred, would be completely shattered not by violence or cruelty, but by the simple act of sharing a meal. This is the story of how 37 terrified prisoners discovered that humanity could triumph over the most poisonous lies of war. The gymnasium had been converted hastily into a temporary holding facility by the advancing Allied forces. Sunlight streamed through broken glass, casting geometric patterns across the worn wooden floor where these women now sat in small clusters, their faces etched with exhaustion and terror. They had been captured during the retreat from the Rhine, a mixture of military auxiliaries, communications personnel, and civilian workers who had been caught up in the chaos of Germany's collapsing Western Front. Greta Hoffmann was 23 years old, with auburn hair that she kept tied back in a practical bun, despite the circumstances. She had spent the last 2 years operating radio equipment for the German military communications network, transmitting coded messages between command posts scattered across the crumbling defensive lines. Born in a small village near Stuttgart, she had grown up believing the stories she had been told about racial hierarchies and the supposed savagery of non-European peoples. These beliefs, hammered into her consciousness through years of education and propaganda, had become as fundamental to her worldview as her knowledge of radio frequencies and encryption protocols. Beside her sat Ingrid Müller, a nurse who had served in field hospitals from Normandy to the Ardennes. At 28, she was among the oldest of the captured women, and her medical training had given her a practical outlook that often cut through hysteria and panic. Yet even her scientific education had been corrupted by the racial theories that had poisoned German institutions. She had been taught to view different racial groups through the lens of pseudoscientific hierarchies, and despite her medical knowledge, she found herself gripped by the same primitive fears that haunted her companions. The third member of their informal group was Anna Weber, barely 19 years old and a former clerk in the logistics department, responsible for coordinating supply movements across the Western territories. Her youth and inexperience made her particularly vulnerable to the terror that had settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. She had never traveled far from her hometown before the conflict, and her understanding of the world beyond Germany's borders came entirely from the distorted accounts that had shaped her generation's worldview. These 3 women, along with 34 others, represented a cross-section of German society during the final phase of the European conflict. They included teachers, seamstresses, telephone operators, administrative clerks, factory workers, and medical assistants. Some had volunteered for military service out of patriotic duty. Others had been conscripted as the conflict's demands grew ever more desperate. What united them now was not their diverse backgrounds, but their shared terror of what they believed awaited them in Allied captivity. The propaganda they had absorbed throughout their lives painted a picture of Allied forces as barely civilized savages, particularly the colonial troops and American units that included soldiers of African descent. They had been told stories of cannibalism, ritual torture, and systematic assault that bore no resemblance to reality, but had been crafted specifically to maintain fighting morale through absolute terror of capture. These fabricated accounts had been so pervasive and detailed that even educated women like Ingrid found themselves believing the most outlandish claims. As morning turned to afternoon, the sound of approaching vehicles grew more distinct. Through the broken windows, they could see Allied soldiers setting up a command post in the school courtyard. The sight of unfamiliar uniforms and equipment sent waves of panic through the group. Several women began to sob quietly, while others prayed in whispered voices that seemed to echo off the empty walls of their makeshift prison. Greta found herself studying the soldiers visible through the windows, trying to determine their nationality and unit designation. Her training in military communications had taught her to recognize different uniform patterns and insignia. But the distance and her own fear made it difficult to focus clearly. What she could see filled her with mounting dread. These were not the German soldiers she was familiar with, but foreign troops whose presence represented everything she had been taught to fear. The morning had begun with rumors spreading through their group like wildfire. Someone claimed to have overheard guards discussing their transfer to a different facility. Another whispered that they were to be questioned by intelligence officers. But most terrifying of all were the hushed conversations about which Allied units were responsible for their sector. When word spread that American forces included soldiers of African descent, the level of panic in the room reached new heights. Hannah Weber had grown up in a rural community where the only knowledge of Africa came from colonial adventure stories and racial propaganda that portrayed the continent and its peoples in the most primitive terms imaginable. Her education had included pseudoscientific theories about racial differences that bore no resemblance to anthropological reality, but served to justify the hierarchical worldview that underpinned German ideology during this period. These distorted teachings had created in her mind a picture of African peoples as fundamentally different from and hostile to Europeans. The irony was profound and tragic. These women, who had been taught to view themselves as representatives of a superior civilization, now cowered in fear of people whose actual character and values they had never been allowed to understand. The propaganda that had shaped their worldview had been so comprehensive and systematic that it had replaced genuine knowledge with carefully crafted lies designed to serve political purposes rather than reflect reality. Ingrid Müller tried to maintain her composure by focusing on practical medical concerns. She worried about sanitation in their overcrowded temporary quarters, about the health implications of stress and poor nutrition, about the medical needs of some of the older women in their group who had chronic conditions requiring medication. Yet even her medical training could not entirely suppress the irrational fears that had been planted in her mind through years of exposure to racial propaganda. The facility itself bore witness to the chaos of the conflict's final phase. Classroom walls still displayed educational posters and maps from before the war, creating a surreal juxtaposition between the innocent purpose of the building and its current function as a detention center. Desks had been pushed against the walls to create open floor space, and the women had arranged themselves into small groups based on shared regional backgrounds or military units. Outside, the organizational efficiency of the Allied forces was becoming increasingly evident. Supply trucks arrived with mathematical precision, communication equipment was installed with professional competence, and the entire operation proceeded with a level of coordination that reflected years of experience in occupation and reconstruction. This was not the chaotic rampage that German propaganda had predicted, but a methodical and disciplined military operation conducted by professional soldiers following established procedures. Yet the women inside remained unaware of this reality. Their fear had created a psychological barrier that prevented them from accurately interpreting what they observed. Every efficient movement of Allied personnel was seen through the distorted lens of their propaganda-induced expectations, reinforcing their terror rather than providing reassurance about their likely treatment. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the gymnasium floor, a new level of activity became apparent outside. More vehicles arrived, including what appeared to be supply trucks carrying food and equipment. The women could hear voices speaking in English, a language that most of them understood only fragmentarily, but the tone seemed businesslike rather than threatening. Still, their fear transformed every neutral activity into potential confirmation of their worst expectations. Greta found herself appointed as an informal leader of their group, partly because of her military communications background, and partly because her practical nature provided some stability in the midst of widespread panic. She tried to organize their meager possessions, establish a rotation for the single functional toilet facility, and maintain some semblance of order among women who were struggling with exhaustion, hunger, and terror. The logistics of their situation were becoming increasingly apparent. 37 women confined in a space designed for physical education classes with minimal sanitation facilities and no privacy represented a significant challenge for their captors as well as for themselves. Yet the efficiency with which Allied forces were addressing these practical concerns suggested a level of preparation and professionalism that contradicted the chaotic savagery that German propaganda had led them to expect. Food had been their most immediate concern since their capture the previous day. Their last meal had been a meager portion of bread and ersatz coffee distributed by retreating German forces more than 24 hours earlier. Hunger was beginning to weaken the older women particularly, and several had begun to show signs of dehydration despite the spring weather. The absence of adequate nutrition was making their psychological state even more fragile. When rumors began to circulate that their captors were preparing to provide a meal, the women's reactions were complex and contradictory. Hunger made them desperate for sustenance, yet their propaganda-induced fears created suspicion about any food offered by Allied forces. Some whispered that the meal might be drugged or poisoned. Others worried that accepting food would somehow make them complicit in their own destruction. The depth of their indoctrination had created a psychological state where even basic human necessities became sources of terror. Anna Weber found herself caught between the physical demands of hunger and the psychological weight of her fears. Her youth made her particularly vulnerable to both physical deprivation and emotional distress. She had never been away from her family's protection for more than a few days, and the combination of capture, confinement, and terror had pushed her to the edge of complete breakdown. Only the presence of older women like Greta and Ingrid provided any anchor to stability. The educational posters still hanging on the classroom walls created an almost surreal backdrop to their situation. Maps of Europe from before the conflict showed borders that no longer existed. Scientific diagrams illustrated principles of physics and chemistry that seemed irrelevant to their current predicament. Most ironic of all were the motivational slogans promoting German cultural achievements and technological progress, now hollow mockeries in light of their nation's collapsing military position. Yet these remnants of normal educational life also provided a strange comfort. They reminded the women that beneath the chaos of conflict lay a foundation of human learning and achievement that transcended national boundaries. The scientific principles displayed on the walls were universal truths that belonged to all humanity. The mathematical equations had been discovered and refined by scholars from many different countries and cultures, working together over centuries of intellectual collaboration. As evening approached, the level of activity outside their makeshift prison increased dramatically. More Allied personnel arrived, including what appeared to be administrative officers carrying clipboards and documentation. The systematic approach to their situation suggested that their captors were following established procedures for prisoner processing rather than acting on impulse or emotion. This contradicted everything they had been taught about Allied treatment of German captives. The sound of generators being started indicated that the temporary command post was being equipped for extended operation. Electric lights began to illuminate the courtyard outside their windows, creating pools of brightness in the gathering darkness. The professional efficiency of the entire operation was undeniable, yet the women's fear prevented them from recognizing these positive signs. Greta used her military communications training to try to interpret the sounds and activities she could observe. The radio chatter she could hear through the windows followed standard military communication protocols. The vehicle movements adhered to established security procedures. The overall organization reflected a level of discipline and professionalism that suggested their captors were experienced soldiers operating under clear command authority rather than an undisciplined mob seeking revenge. Yet even her technical knowledge could not entirely overcome the psychological conditioning that had shaped her worldview. The rational part of her mind recognized the signs of military professionalism, but deeper fears continued to generate anxiety about their ultimate fate. The propaganda she had absorbed for years had created emotional responses that were not easily overcome by logical analysis. The other women looked to her for guidance and reassurance, but Greta struggled with her own internal conflicts. Her responsibility as an informal leader required her to project confidence and stability, yet she was fighting the same fears that plagued her companions. The weight of others' expectations added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. Ingrid Müller used her medical training to monitor the health of their group. Several of the older women were showing signs of stress-related illness, including elevated blood pressure and irregular heart rhythms, that could be dangerous if their situation continued to deteriorate. The youngest members of their group, like Anna Weber, were displaying symptoms of acute anxiety that could lead to complete psychological breakdown if not addressed soon. The medical implications of prolonged stress and inadequate nutrition were becoming increasingly serious. Without proper food, clean water, and basic sanitation, their group would begin to experience health problems that could become life-threatening within days. Yet Ingrid's medical knowledge also told her that their captors' systematic approach to establishing the detention facility suggested awareness of these practical concerns. As darkness fell completely, artificial lighting transformed the school courtyard into a well-illuminated operational area. The contrast between the organized, well-equipped Allied forces outside and the frightened, exhausted women inside could not have been more stark. Yet this technological and organizational superiority, rather than providing reassurance about their likely treatment, only reinforced their fears about the power disparity they faced. The efficiency of Allied logistics was becoming undeniably apparent. Supply trucks arrived with clockwork precision, unloading equipment and materials that were quickly distributed to their designated locations. Communication equipment was installed and tested with professional competence. The entire operation proceeded according to plans that had obviously been developed through extensive experience in similar situations. Food preparation had begun in earnest, in what appeared to be a field kitchen, established in the school's former dining area. The aromas drifting through the building suggested a substantial meal being prepared with fresh ingredients and proper cooking techniques. For women who had been subsisting on increasingly meager rations for months, these smells triggered powerful physical responses despite their psychological fears. The contrast between the reality of their situation and their expectations could not have been more dramatic. Instead of the chaos and brutality that German propaganda had led them to expect, they were witnessing a methodical, professional operation conducted by soldiers who appeared to be following established humanitarian protocols. Yet their conditioning prevented them from recognizing these positive signs. Anna Weber found herself torn between hunger and terror as the smell of cooking food grew stronger. Her stomach cramped with need, yet her mind recoiled from the possibility of accepting sustenance from those she had been taught to view as mortal enemies. The psychological conditioning she had received was so powerful that it overrode even basic survival instincts. The irony of their situation was profound. These women, who had been taught to view themselves as representatives of an advanced civilization, were now cowering in primitive fear of people whose actual character they had never been allowed to understand. The propaganda that had shaped their worldview had been so comprehensive that it had replaced knowledge with carefully crafted lies designed to serve political rather than educational purposes. Evening brought new sounds from outside their temporary prison. Voices speaking in accented English indicated the presence of soldiers from various Allied nations. The diversity of accents and languages suggested a truly international force rather than the homogeneous army that German propaganda had described. This multinational character of Allied forces was itself evidence of the cooperative spirit that contradicted everything they had been taught about their enemies. Yet the women inside remained focused on their specific terror of African American troops. The propaganda they had absorbed had created particularly vivid and horrific images associated with soldiers of African descent. Images that bore no resemblance to reality, but had been crafted specifically to generate maximum fear and hatred. These fabricated stories had been so detailed and pervasive that even educated women found themselves believing the most outlandish claims. The educational background of many of these women made their susceptibility to such propaganda particularly tragic. Greta had received training in advanced communications technology that required mathematical and scientific knowledge. Ingrid possessed medical education that should have provided her with a rational, evidence-based approach to understanding human nature. Anna had completed secondary education that included exposure to literature and history from multiple cultures. Yet all of this genuine learning had been corrupted by the systematic insertion of racial propaganda into every aspect of German education during this period. Scientific principles had been distorted to support pseudoscientific theories of racial hierarchy. Medical knowledge had been twisted to justify discriminatory practices. Historical education had been rewritten to support nationalist mythology rather than factual understanding. The result was a generation of Germans who possessed technical competence in specific areas while maintaining fundamentally distorted views of human nature and social organization. Their specialized knowledge made them effective in narrow professional roles, while their broader worldview remained poisoned by systematic lies designed to support political rather than educational goals. As the evening progressed, the sounds of meal preparation became more distinct. The clanking of metal cookware, the sizzle of food being cooked over open flames, and the voices of cooks coordinating their efforts created an almost domestic atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the military precision of the overall operation. This combination of professional efficiency and human warmth suggested an approach to prisoner care that was both systematic and humane. The women could hear laughter and casual conversation among the Allied soldiers, indicating a relaxed confidence that contradicted the tense, desperate atmosphere they associated with their own military experience during the final phase of the conflict. These soldiers sounded like people who expected to go home soon, who maintained their humanity despite years of warfare, who approached their duties with professionalism rather than hatred. Yet these positive signs were filtered through the women's psychological conditioning in ways that prevented accurate interpretation. Every indication of Allied strength and organization was seen as evidence of their own vulnerability. Every sign of efficiency was interpreted as preparation for systematic abuse. Their fear had created a cognitive filter that transformed neutral or positive information into confirmation of their worst expectations. The preparation of dinner had begun several hours earlier under the supervision of Sergeant First Class Marcus Washington, a career soldier from Detroit who had volunteered for overseas service despite the segregation policies that still affected American military units. At 32 years old, he possessed 15 years of military experience, including extensive training in prisoner administration and logistics coordination. His assignment to oversee meal preparation for the German women prisoners was both a practical recognition of his organizational abilities and a test of the evolving policies regarding racial integration in Allied forces. Washington had grown up in a working-class family where his mother's emphasis on education and his father's military service during the previous world conflict had instilled values of discipline, compassion, and service to others, regardless of their background or circumstances. His military career had been marked by consistent professionalism and a reputation for treating all personnel under his authority with fairness and dignity, qualities that had earned him respect from both superiors and subordinates, despite the racial prejudices that still infected many military units. The irony of his current assignment was not lost on him. These German women, who had been taught to view people of African descent as subhuman savages, were now dependent on his professional competence and personal integrity for their well-being. He understood the propaganda they had been exposed to, having encountered similar attitudes among some American troops, as well as captured German personnel. His response was to demonstrate through his actions the fundamental falseness of such racial stereotypes. The meal he was preparing represented more than simple sustenance. It was a statement about human dignity, professional responsibility, and the values that distinguished Allied forces from the regime they had opposed. Washington had insisted on using the best available ingredients, preparing the food according to proper nutritional standards, and serving it in a manner that respected the prisoners' humanity, despite their former allegiance to an enemy ideology. His team included soldiers from multiple backgrounds: Private Joseph Kowalski from Chicago, whose Polish immigrant parents had fled European persecution; Corporal David Martinez from New Mexico, whose family had lived in the American Southwest for generations; and Private James O'Brien from Boston, whose Irish heritage connected him to struggles against ethnic discrimination. This diverse group worked together with the easy cooperation that characterized well-trained military units, their different backgrounds contributing to their collective effectiveness rather than creating division. The kitchen facilities they had established in the former school dining hall represented a significant logistical achievement. Portable cooking equipment had been transported, assembled, and supplied with fuel, water, and ingredients in less than 6 hours. The meal they were preparing would feed not only the 37 German women prisoners, but also the Allied personnel assigned to the facility, a practical demonstration of the principle that all human beings deserved adequate nutrition, regardless of their circumstances. Washington supervised the preparation of a substantial dinner that included fresh vegetables, protein sources, bread, and even a simple dessert prepared from available ingredients. The nutritional content of this meal exceeded what many of the German women had received during the final months of the conflict, when their nation's collapsing logistics system had reduced military and civilian rations to survival levels. This abundance was both a humanitarian gesture and a practical demonstration of Allied logistical superiority. The cooking process itself reflected values that contradicted everything the German women had been taught about Allied forces: attention to cleanliness, careful preparation techniques, and concern for nutritional balance demonstrated a civilized approach to food preparation that bore no resemblance to the savage behavior described in German propaganda. The professional competence displayed in meal preparation was consistent with the overall military efficiency that characterized Allied operations. As the dinner neared completion, Washington reviewed the service procedures that would be followed when the meal was distributed to the prisoners. Each woman would be served individually, with attention to any special dietary needs or medical requirements that had been identified during processing. The food would be presented on proper dinnerware rather than crude containers, and adequate time would be provided for them to eat in relative comfort and privacy. These service procedures had been developed through months of experience in prisoner administration across multiple theaters of the global conflict. Allied forces had learned that treating prisoners with dignity and respect served both humanitarian and practical purposes, often producing valuable intelligence cooperation while demonstrating the moral superiority of democratic values over totalitarian ideology. The German women, meanwhile, remained huddled in their makeshift quarters, unaware of the care and preparation that was being invested in their evening meal. Their fear had reached such intensity that several were physically ill, while others had retreated into psychological withdrawal that bordered on catatonic states. The contrast between their terror and the reality of their situation would soon become undeniably apparent. Anna Weber had become the focus of particular concern among her companions. At 19, she was among the youngest of the captured women, and her psychological state had deteriorated throughout the day. She had eaten nothing since their capture, despite encouragement from Greta and Ingrid, and her refusal to consume even water was beginning to create serious medical concerns. Her terror had become so intense that she was unable to think rationally about her situation. The approaching dinner service would represent a crucial test of the women's ability to overcome their propaganda-induced fears and respond to the reality of their treatment. For many of them, this would be their first direct personal contact with African-American soldiers, and their reactions would be influenced by years of systematic racial indoctrination that bore no resemblance to the actual character of the men responsible for their care. Greta Hoffmann had been trying to prepare her companions for whatever might happen when their captors arrived with food. Her military training had taught her the importance of maintaining discipline and cohesion under stress, but she was struggling with her own fears while trying to provide leadership for increasingly desperate women. The responsibility of leadership in such circumstances was almost overwhelming. Ingrid Meller used her medical knowledge to monitor the health of their group while trying to maintain her own psychological equilibrium. Several women were showing signs of severe dehydration that could become dangerous if they continued to refuse food and water out of fear. Her medical oath required her to encourage treatment and sustenance, yet her own conditioning made it difficult to trust their captors' intentions. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside their gymnasium created immediate panic among the women. Those who had been sitting or lying down struggled to their feet, instinctively clustering together in the center of the room as if physical proximity could provide protection against unknown threats. Their fear had reached such intensity that even the prospect of receiving food generated terror rather than relief. Sergeant Washington approached the gymnasium entrance, accompanied by 3 other soldiers carrying the prepared meal service. His military bearing projected confidence and authority, yet his demeanor remained calm and professional rather than threatening. The contrast between his actual presence and the savage monster that German propaganda had conditioned the women to expect would soon become undeniably apparent. When the door opened and Washington entered the room, the women's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Several screamed outright, while others collapsed to their knees in apparent prayer or supplication. Anna Weber fainted completely, her weakened condition finally overcoming her ability to cope with terror. The sight of an African-American soldier in uniform triggered every fear that years of propaganda had embedded in their consciousness. Yet Washington's response to their terror demonstrated exactly the kind of character that made such fears ridiculous. Instead of reacting with anger or contempt to their obvious prejudice, he maintained his professional composure while directing his team to set up the meal service with calm efficiency. His concern for Anna Weber's collapsed condition was immediate and genuine, reflecting medical training that led him to prioritize human need over personal offense. "Ladies," Washington said in careful German that revealed extensive language training, "we have prepared dinner for you. Please form a line so that we can serve each of you properly. If anyone has special dietary requirements or medical needs, please let us know now." His fluency in their language was itself a shock to the women, who had been taught that Allied soldiers were uneducated savages, incapable of learning foreign languages or understanding complex cultural information. The careful pronunciation and grammatical accuracy of his speech indicated not only intelligence, but respect for their linguistic heritage that contradicted everything they had been told about enemy attitudes toward German culture. Greta found herself functioning as translator between Washington and the other women, despite her own terror. Her military communications background had given her some proficiency in English, and she recognized that cooperation would be necessary for their survival regardless of her personal fears. Yet even this practical decision required her to overcome psychological barriers that had been constructed through years of systematic indoctrination. The meal service proceeded with methodical efficiency that reflected extensive training in prisoner administration. Each woman was served individually, with attention to proper portions and nutritional balance. The food itself exceeded anything they had received during the final months of the conflict. Fresh vegetables, well-prepared protein, bread that was soft and flavorful, and even a dessert that represented luxury beyond their recent experience. Washington and his team maintained professional courtesy throughout the service process, addressing each woman respectfully and ensuring that everyone received adequate nutrition. When several women initially refused to eat out of fear, they were encouraged gently but not forced, with alternative arrangements made for those who needed additional time to overcome their psychological barriers to accepting sustenance from their captors. The reality of their treatment was beginning to penetrate the fog of terror that had dominated their thinking since capture. The food was clearly prepared with care and attention to quality, not the poisoned or contaminated substances that German propaganda had suggested would be forced upon prisoners. The service was courteous and dignified, not the brutal abuse that they had been conditioned to expect. Anna Weber, who had regained consciousness with medical attention from Washington himself, found herself accepting a cup of clean water from the hands of the man she had been taught to view as a savage monster. The gentle care with which he monitored her condition and ensured her recovery from fainting contradicted every stereotype that had shaped her worldview. His medical competence and genuine concern for her well-being were undeniable evidence of his fundamental humanity. Ingrid Müller, with her medical training, was particularly struck by the professional competence that Washington displayed in addressing Anna's collapse. His assessment of her condition was accurate and thorough, his treatment was appropriate and effective, and his follow-up care demonstrated genuine concern for her recovery. These were not the actions of a primitive savage, but of a trained medical professional who happened to be serving in a military capacity. The meal itself, became a revelation for women who had been subsisting on inadequate rations for months. The vegetables were fresh and properly prepared, the protein was well cooked and flavorful, the bread was soft and nutritious, and the dessert represented a luxury they had not experienced since before the conflict began. The abundance and quality of their dinner demonstrated logistical capabilities that exceeded anything they had experienced in German military service during the final phase of the war. More importantly, the manner in which the meal was served challenged every assumption they had been taught about their captor's character and intentions. Washington and his team treated each woman with courtesy and respect, ensuring that everyone received adequate nutrition while maintaining dignity and propriety throughout the process. There was no mockery, no abuse, no demonstration of power beyond the simple assertion of authority necessary for maintaining order and security. The conversation that developed during the meal service provided additional evidence of their captor's actual character. Washington asked about their backgrounds and circumstances, not for interrogation purposes, but out of genuine human interest in understanding their individual situations. His questions were respectful and appropriate. His responses to their answers demonstrated intelligence and education, and his overall demeanor projected competence and integrity, rather than the savage brutality that German propaganda had described. Several women began to weep as the reality of their treatment became undeniable. The contrast between their propaganda-induced expectations and their actual experience was so dramatic that it forced them to confront the fundamental dishonesty of everything they had been taught about racial differences and enemy character. This psychological adjustment was both liberating and traumatic, requiring them to acknowledge that their entire worldview had been based on systematic lies. Greta found herself engaging in actual conversation with Washington as the meal service continued. His questions about her military communications background revealed knowledge of technical subjects that contradicted stereotypes about African American intellectual capabilities. His understanding of German military organization was sophisticated and detailed, indicating extensive education and professional training that made mockery of racial prejudices about cognitive abilities. The other soldiers serving the meal demonstrated similar competence and character. Private Kowalski's careful attention to the women's dietary preferences reflected cultural sensitivity that challenged assumptions about American ignorance of European customs. Corporal Martinez's fluency in multiple languages indicated educational achievements that contradicted stereotypes about ethnic minorities. Private O'Brien's knowledge of German history and culture revealed intellectual sophistication that demolished propaganda about Allied cultural barbarism. As the dinner progressed, the atmosphere in the gymnasium began to change dramatically. The terror that had dominated the women's emotional state since capture was gradually being replaced by confusion, shame, and a growing recognition that they had been systematically deceived about fundamental aspects of reality. This psychological transformation was both necessary and painful, forcing them to confront the extent to which their education and worldview had been corrupted by political manipulation. Anna Weber found herself accepting a second portion of dessert from Washington's hands, an act that would have been unthinkable to her just hours earlier. The kindness and patience he demonstrated in encouraging her to eat properly were inconsistent with everything she had been taught about his racial characteristics. His genuine concern for her health and well-being was forcing her to reconsider assumptions that had shaped her understanding of human nature since childhood. The medical attention that several women required during the meal service provided additional evidence of their captor's character and values. Ingrid Mueller was able to observe Washington's treatment of various minor health issues that arose during the evening, and his competence was undeniable. His medical knowledge exceeded her own in several areas. His diagnostic skills were sophisticated and accurate, and his therapeutic interventions were appropriate and effective. The logistical efficiency demonstrated throughout the meal service also challenged the women's assumptions about Allied capabilities and organization. The food had been prepared and served using equipment and supplies that reflected industrial capacity, far exceeding anything they had experienced in German service during the final months of the conflict. This abundance was not merely military superiority, but evidence of economic and technological advancement that made their nation's claims about comparative civilization appear ridiculous. More subtly, the values demonstrated by their captors throughout the evening challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization that had underpinned German ideology during this period. The cooperation between soldiers of different racial and ethnic backgrounds contradicted theories about natural hierarchy and conflict between human groups. The compassionate treatment of prisoners contradicted claims about the savage nature of non-European peoples. As the meal service concluded, Washington addressed the women collectively in his careful German, explaining the procedures that would govern their detention and the standards of treatment they could expect during their captivity. His words were professional and reassuring, indicating that their care would be guided by international humanitarian law rather than racial prejudice or desire for revenge. "You will be treated according to established protocols for prisoner welfare," Washington explained. "You will receive adequate food, clean water, medical care when needed, and accommodation appropriate to your circumstances. Your cooperation with administrative procedures will be appreciated, but your basic needs will be met, regardless of your attitudes or behavior." The implications of this statement were profound for women who had been taught that capture by Allied forces, particularly by African American troops, would result in torture, abuse, and eventual execution. The contrast between their expectations and the reality of their treatment was forcing them to confront the systematic dishonesty of everything they had been told about enemy character and intentions. The cleanup process that followed their meal provided additional evidence of their captors' character and values. Washington and his team collected dishes and utensils with the same care they had demonstrated in serving the meal, ensuring that the women's temporary quarters remained clean and sanitary. Their attention to proper hygiene and facility maintenance reflected professional standards that exceeded what many of the women had experienced in German military service during the conflict's chaotic final phase. The evening's events had created a psychological crisis for many of the women that would require days or weeks to resolve completely. Their entire understanding of human nature, racial characteristics, and social organization had been challenged by direct personal experience that contradicted years of systematic indoctrination. This cognitive dissonance was both necessary for their psychological healing and traumatic in its immediate impact. Anna Weber lay on her makeshift bedding that night, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile the kindness she had experienced with the savage brutality she had been taught to expect. The gentle care with which Washington had monitored her health throughout the evening was inconsistent with everything she had been told about African American character. His medical competence and genuine concern for her well-being were forcing her to question fundamental assumptions about human nature that had shaped her worldview since childhood. Greta Hoffman found herself reviewing the conversations she had shared with Washington during the meal service, recognizing the intelligence and education he had displayed in discussing technical subjects related to her military communications background. His sophisticated understanding of complex technological and organizational issues challenged every stereotype she had been taught about racial intellectual capabilities. Ingrid Mueller used her medical training to analyze the treatment techniques she had observed Washington employ during the evening. His diagnostic accuracy, therapeutic knowledge, and professional competence were undeniable evidence of extensive medical education that contradicted claims about African American intellectual limitations. The quality of his patient care exceeded what she had observed from many German medical personnel during her own military service. The gymnasium remained quiet throughout the night, but it was not the silence of terror that had characterized their first evening in captivity. Instead, it was the contemplative quiet of women, struggling to reconstruct their understanding of reality based on evidence that contradicted everything they had previously believed about human nature and social organization. This psychological transformation would continue over the following days and weeks as they encountered additional evidence of their captors' actual character. The morning brought new revelations as the women awakened to find clean water and basic sanitation supplies provided by their captors during the night. The attention to their hygiene needs reflected concern for their health and dignity that was inconsistent with the neglect and abuse they had expected. These practical considerations demonstrated that their welfare was being managed according to professional standards rather than racial prejudice. Washington appeared again during the morning meal service, accompanied by different members of his team, but maintaining the same professional courtesy and genuine concern for their well-being that had characterized his behavior the previous evening. His consistency in treating them with dignity and respect was providing evidence that his kindness was not a temporary aberration, but a reflection of his fundamental character and values. The breakfast he provided was substantial and nutritious, including foods that had become luxuries during the final months of the conflict. Fresh fruits, real coffee, bread that was soft and flavorful, and protein sources that were properly prepared and generous in quantity demonstrated logistical capabilities that far exceeded their recent experience. This abundance was both humanitarianly welcome and strategically significant as evidence of Allied economic superiority. During the morning meal, several women began to engage in tentative conversation with Washington and his team. Their questions revealed curiosity about American society, African American experiences, and the values that motivated their captors' behavior. Washington's responses were thoughtful and educational, providing information about American racial integration efforts, military service opportunities, and social progress that contradicted German propaganda about American society. Anna Weber found herself asking Washington about his family background and personal history, questions that would have been unthinkable to her just 24 hours earlier. His answers revealed a life story of educational achievement, military service, and community involvement that challenged every stereotype she had been taught about African American capabilities and character. His description of his parents' values and his own aspirations demonstrated philosophical sophistication that contradicted theories about racial intellectual differences. The educational background that Washington described during these conversations was itself a revelation for women who had been taught that African Americans were intellectually inferior and culturally primitive. His formal education included university study, advanced military training, and technical specialization that exceeded the educational achievements of many of the German women themselves. This evidence of intellectual capability was forcing them to confront the falseness of racial theories that had shaped their worldview. Greta discovered that Washington's knowledge of military communications technology was sophisticated and current, reflecting access to technical education that contradicted claims about American technological inferiority. His understanding of frequency management, encryption techniques, and network coordination was comprehensive and detailed, indicating exposure to advanced technical training that challenged German assumptions about enemy capabilities. Ingrid engaged Washington in discussions about medical techniques and pharmaceutical developments, discovering that his knowledge in these areas was both extensive and current. His familiarity with recent advances in surgical procedures, disease treatment, and preventive medicine reflected access to scientific information and educational resources that contradicted propaganda about American medical primitiveness. The other Allied personnel who assisted with meal service and facility maintenance provided additional evidence of competence and character that challenged the women's assumptions about enemy forces. The diversity of backgrounds represented among their captors demonstrated the international character of Allied operations, while the consistency of professional behavior indicated shared values that transcended national and racial differences. Private Kowalski's family history as Polish immigrants who had fled European persecution resonated with several of the German women whose own families had experienced displacement during earlier conflicts. His description of American opportunities for social advancement and cultural integration contradicted German propaganda about American ethnic oppression and social rigidity. Corporal Martinez's knowledge of European history and culture was sophisticated and accurate, challenging assumptions about American educational standards and cultural awareness. His fluency in multiple languages reflected intellectual capabilities that exceeded those of many German military personnel the women had encountered during their own service. Private O'Brien's understanding of German literature and philosophy was both surprising and impressive, indicating exposure to intellectual traditions that German propaganda had claimed were uniquely European achievements. His thoughtful discussions of cultural and philosophical issues demonstrated educational sophistication that contradicted stereotypes about American intellectual limitations. As the second day of their captivity progressed, the women began to experience a fundamental transformation in their understanding of human nature and social organization. The evidence of their captors' character and capabilities was overwhelming and undeniable, forcing them to confront the systematic dishonesty of their previous education and worldview. The practical aspects of their detention continued to reflect professional competence and humanitarian concern that exceeded their expectations. Medical care was provided promptly and competently when needed. Food service maintained high standards of nutrition and quality. Sanitation facilities were properly maintained and supplied. Recreation opportunities were provided within the constraints of security requirements. More importantly, their interactions with Allied personnel continued to demonstrate character and values that contradicted everything they had been taught about enemy intentions and behavior. Their captors displayed intelligence, education, compassion, and integrity that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial and national characteristics. The psychological impact of these revelations was profound and complex. Many women experienced shame and guilt about their previous prejudices, alongside relief about their actual treatment. Others struggled with anger about the deception they had experienced, alongside gratitude for their captors' kindness. The process of reconstructing their worldview based on accurate information rather than propaganda was both necessary and emotionally challenging. Hannah Weber began to write letters to her family, describing her experiences and attempting to convey the reality of her treatment compared to their shared expectations. Her efforts to explain the kindness and competence of her African-American captors required her to use language and concepts that challenged the racial vocabulary she had learned during her education. Finding words to describe human dignity and professional competence that transcended racial categories was itself an educational process. Greta found herself reviewing her military communications training to identify where technical information had been accurate while social and political content had been deliberately distorted. Her recognition that professional competence and intellectual capability were independent of racial characteristics was forcing her to reconstruct her understanding of human potential and social organization. Ingrid used her medical knowledge to analyze the treatment techniques she continued to observe among Allied personnel. Recognizing that scientific competence and humanitarian values were consistently demonstrated, regardless of the racial or national backgrounds of individual practitioners, her professional experience was providing evidence that contradicted racial theories about intellectual and moral capabilities. The third day brought new challenges and opportunities as administrative procedures required more extensive interaction between the women and their captors. Processing for eventual transfer to permanent prisoner facilities involved interviews, documentation, and coordination that required sustained cooperation and communication. Washington supervised these administrative procedures with the same professional competence and personal courtesy that had characterized his previous interactions with the women. His organizational abilities and attention to detail ensured that bureaucratic requirements were met efficiently, while maintaining dignity and respect for the individual circumstances of each prisoner. During these interviews, several women shared personal information about their backgrounds, families, and experiences that provided Washington and his team with insights into German society and the impact of propaganda on individual consciousness. These conversations were conducted with sensitivity and respect, avoiding both judgment and condescension, while encouraging honest reflection about past beliefs and future possibilities. The administrative process also provided opportunities for the women to observe Allied military organization and efficiency at close range. The coordination between different units, the systematic approach to complex logistical challenges, and the professional competence demonstrated throughout these procedures provided evidence of organizational capabilities that exceeded their previous experience. More significantly, these extended interactions allowed deeper relationships to develop between captors and prisoners that further challenged preconceptions and stereotypes. Washington's discussions with individual women about their personal experiences and future plans demonstrated genuine concern for their welfare that transcended professional duty. His conversations with Anna Weber about her educational aspirations and career goals revealed values and perspectives that were entirely consistent with her own family's emphasis on learning and achievement. His encouragement of her intellectual development and his suggestions about educational opportunities available in peacetime contradicted everything she had been taught about African American attitudes toward women's advancement. Greta's technical discussions with Washington about communications technology evolved into broader conversations about scientific progress and technological development that demonstrated his understanding of complex intellectual issues. His knowledge of recent advances in multiple scientific fields was comprehensive and current, reflecting educational opportunities and intellectual curiosity that challenged racial stereotypes about cognitive capabilities. Ingrid's medical conversations with Washington revealed shared professional values and therapeutic philosophies that transcended racial and national boundaries. Their discussions about patient care, medical ethics, and public health demonstrated common educational backgrounds and humanitarian commitments that contradicted theories about racial differences in moral development. The evidence accumulating through these interactions was forcing fundamental changes in the women's understanding of human nature and social organization. Their direct personal experience with African American competence, intelligence, and character was overwhelming the psychological barriers created by years of systematic racial propaganda. The fourth day brought news that their transfer to a permanent prisoner facility had been scheduled, meaning that their time under Washington's supervision was nearing its end. This prospect created mixed emotions among the women, who had come to appreciate his professional competence and personal kindness, while recognizing that their future treatment might not maintain the same standards. Washington used their final full day together to address concerns about their upcoming transfer and to provide information about prisoner treatment protocols that would govern their future detention. His explanations were detailed and reassuring, indicating that humanitarian standards would be maintained regardless of which Allied personnel assumed responsibility for their care. His farewell conversations with individual women provided opportunities for them to express gratitude for his treatment and to acknowledge the transformation in their understanding that had resulted from their interactions. These personal discussions were emotionally significant for both captors and prisoners, representing acknowledgement of shared humanity that transcended the artificial barriers created by conflict and propaganda. Anna Weber found herself struggling to articulate her appreciation for Washington's kindness and her shame about her previous prejudices. Her attempts to apologize for her initial terror and to thank him for his patient treatment required her to confront directly the falseness of her previous beliefs and the depth of her transformation. Greta's farewell focused on professional respect for Washington's competence and leadership abilities, acknowledging that his military skills and organizational capabilities exceeded those of many German officers she had encountered during her own service. Her recognition of his professional excellence required her to abandon assumptions about racial limitations that had been fundamental to her previous worldview. Ingrid's medical background allowed her to appreciate fully the quality of care that Washington had provided to their group, recognizing that his treatment had exceeded professional standards while demonstrating personal compassion that reflected exceptional character. Her acknowledgement of his medical expertise required her to confront the falseness of racial theories about intellectual capabilities. The transfer preparations provided final evidence of Washington's character and values, as he ensured that each woman's personal belongings were properly secured and that any special needs or medical requirements were carefully documented for their next captors. His attention to these details reflected genuine concern for their continued welfare beyond his own responsibility. The buses that arrived to transport them to their new facility were clean, comfortable, and properly equipped for passenger transport, rather than the crude cattle cars that German propaganda had suggested would be used for prisoner movement. The professional competence demonstrated in organizing their transfer was consistent with the overall quality of treatment they had experienced under Washington's supervision. As they prepared to leave the school facility that had been their temporary prison, the women found themselves looking back with emotions that would have been incomprehensible to them just days earlier. The place they had initially viewed as a chamber of horrors had become associated with kindness, competence, and human dignity that had transformed their understanding of reality. Washington's final address to the group emphasized themes of human dignity, mutual respect, and hope for future reconciliation between former enemies. His words reflected educational sophistication and philosophical depth that challenged assumptions about intellectual capabilities while providing comfort and encouragement for their uncertain future. The transportation to their new facility provided opportunities for the women to discuss their experiences and to process the psychological transformation they had undergone during their brief detention under Washington's supervision. Their conversations revealed the depth of change in their understanding of human nature and social organization. Anna Weber found herself defending African American capabilities and character to other prisoners who had not shared her experience, requiring her to articulate beliefs that would have been unthinkable to her just days earlier. Her ability to challenge racial stereotypes and to advocate for human dignity represented a complete reversal of her previous worldview. Greta's discussions with other prisoners about Allied military competence included detailed descriptions of Washington's professional capabilities and leadership qualities, providing evidence that contradicted racial theories about intellectual and organizational abilities. Her testimony about his character and competence was influential in changing other prisoners' attitudes and expectations. Ingrid's medical perspective on their treatment under Washington's supervision provided authoritative evidence of his professional competence and humanitarian values, challenging other prisoners' preconceptions about African American capabilities and character. Her professional endorsement of his medical knowledge and therapeutic skills was particularly persuasive. Their arrival at the permanent prisoner facility revealed that the humanitarian treatment they had experienced under Washington's supervision was not exceptional, but standard practice for Allied prisoner administration. The consistency of professional competence and humane treatment across different facilities and personnel demonstrated that their positive experience reflected systemic values rather than individual kindness. The months that followed their transfer provided opportunities for the women to observe additional evidence of Allied character and capabilities through interactions with personnel from various national and racial backgrounds. Their experience with Washington had prepared them to recognize competence and character that transcended superficial differences while appreciating the fundamental humanity that united all people regardless of their backgrounds. The educational opportunities provided in the permanent facility allowed many of the women to expand their understanding of history, science, and culture beyond the distorted information they had received during their German education. Access to uncensored books, newspapers, and educational materials revealed the extent to which their previous worldview had been shaped by systematic propaganda rather than factual information. Anna Weber used these educational resources to study American history and African American contributions to science, technology, and culture, discovering achievements and capabilities that had been systematically excluded from her previous education. Her growing understanding of historical reality provided context for appreciating Washington's individual excellence within a broader tradition of African American achievement. Greta's access to technical literature revealed the extent of American and Allied technological capabilities that had been systematically minimized or ignored in German education. Her recognition of technological and organizational superiority that had enabled Allied victory provided context for understanding the competence that Washington had demonstrated in their brief interaction. Ingrid's medical studies revealed scientific advances and therapeutic techniques that demonstrated the international character of medical progress, challenging nationalist assumptions about cultural and intellectual superiority that had shaped her previous worldview. Her growing appreciation of scientific collaboration across racial and national boundaries provided context for understanding Washington's medical competence. The correspondence opportunities available in the permanent facility allowed the women to communicate with their families about their experiences and to share their transformed understanding of human nature and social organization. Their letters describing Washington's treatment and character provided evidence that challenged racial prejudices among their family members and communities. These personal testimonies about African American competence and character were particularly influential because they came from women who had previously shared the racial prejudices common in German society. Their credible witness to Washington's excellence carried special weight in challenging assumptions and stereotypes that had been fundamental to their community's worldview. The process of reconstruction and reconciliation that followed the conflict's end provided broader context for understanding the significance of individual interactions like those between Washington and the German women prisoners. Their personal transformation reflected the larger process of social and cultural change that would be necessary for establishing lasting peace. Years later, as Germany underwent democratization and denazification, many of the women who had experienced Washington's care became advocates for racial equality and international understanding. Their personal testimonies about his character and competence were influential in challenging racial prejudices and promoting social progress in post-war German society. Anna Weber eventually pursued advanced education that had been interrupted by the conflict, using her experience with Washington as inspiration for studying international relations and racial equality. Her academic work focused on the psychological impact of propaganda and the importance of personal experience in overcoming prejudice and promoting understanding between different groups. Greta Hoffmann's post-war career in communications technology included collaboration with American and African American engineers and scientists, relationships that built upon the respect for competence and character that had begun with her interaction with Washington. Her professional success in international technical cooperation demonstrated the practical benefits of abandoning racial prejudices. Ingrid Möhler's medical practice included service in international humanitarian organizations that brought her into contact with healthcare professionals from diverse racial and national backgrounds. Her commitment to medical cooperation across cultural boundaries reflected values that had been reinforced by her observation of Washington's professional competence and humanitarian character. The broader historical significance of interactions like these between German prisoners and Allied personnel lay in their demonstration that racial reconciliation and international understanding were possible despite years of systematic propaganda and indoctrination. Personal experience with competence and character that transcended racial boundaries provided foundation for social progress that extended far beyond individual relationships. The systematic nature of German racial propaganda had created barriers to understanding that required direct personal experience to overcome. Intellectual arguments alone were insufficient to challenge beliefs that had been embedded through years of systematic indoctrination, but personal interaction with individuals whose character and capabilities contradicted racial stereotypes provided irrefutable evidence that forced psychological transformation. Washington's professional competence and personal integrity represented values and capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions of racial propaganda while demonstrating the possibility of human excellence that transcended superficial differences. His treatment of German women prisoners provided a model of humanitarian leadership that reflected the broader moral superiority of democratic values over totalitarian ideology. The logistics and organization that had enabled Washington to provide humanitarian care for the prisoners also demonstrated the technological and economic superiority that had ensured Allied victory in the global conflict. The abundance of food, medical supplies, and other necessities that had been available for prisoner care reflected industrial capabilities that far exceeded German achievements during the same period. More significantly, the values that motivated Washington's humanitarian treatment of former enemies reflected philosophical and cultural development that contradicted theories about Western civilizational superiority that had underpinned German ideology. His demonstration of moral excellence challenged assumptions about cultural hierarchy while providing evidence of ethical progress that transcended racial and national boundaries. The international character of Allied forces that had been represented in the team working under Washington's supervision demonstrated the possibility of cooperation across racial and national boundaries that contradicted German theories about inevitable conflict between different groups. The successful collaboration between personnel from diverse backgrounds provided evidence of social organization that transcended tribal loyalties. The educational and technical competence displayed by Washington and his team represented intellectual achievements that contradicted racial theories about cognitive capabilities, while demonstrating the benefits of democratic educational systems that promoted merit rather than hereditary privilege. Their professional excellence reflected social values that enabled individual development regardless of background circumstances. The medical competence that Washington had demonstrated in caring for the women prisoners represented scientific knowledge and therapeutic skill that contradicted assumptions about racial intellectual limitations while providing evidence of educational opportunities available in democratic societies. His medical expertise reflected social progress that promoted human welfare rather than ideological conformity. The cultural sophistication that Washington had displayed in his conversations with the women reflected educational opportunities and intellectual development that contradicted stereotypes about American cultural limitations while demonstrating the benefits of democratic societies that promoted learning and achievement. His knowledge of European culture and history reflected intellectual curiosity and educational access that transcended racial boundaries. As evening fell on what would be their final day under Washington's supervision, the transformation of the German women prisoners from terror-stricken captives to grateful beneficiaries of his care provided compelling evidence of the power of personal experience to overcome systematic propaganda and indoctrination. Their psychological journey from racial hatred to human appreciation represented the possibility of reconciliation and understanding that would be essential for establishing lasting peace. The farewell ceremony that Washington organized for their departure included expressions of mutual respect and appreciation that would have been inconceivable when they first arrived as terrified prisoners convinced that they would be tortured and consumed by savage enemies. Their recognition of his character and competence represented personal growth that transcended the artificial barriers created by conflict and ideology. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.